The most dangerous stuff is the stuff that is just like, it's the shut up stuff. It's trying to silence you all the time, so that when you go to say something, you think twice about it, and that is dangerous.
On the 5th of May 2019, Sam Smithers, chief executive of the Fawcett Society, launched an online petition calling for a lifetime ban from standing for elected office for anyone promoting rape or violence. She proposed that anyone who issued threats of rape or violence or who incited hatred should be barred from public office because by inviting the electorate to vote for them, we are essentially endorsing and legitimising their conduct. Smithers' petition followed calls by Labour MP Jess Phillips for UKIP European election candidate Carl Benjamin to be banned from standing for public office after she was shown a video where he joked about the possibility of raping her. And the Electoral Commission's confirmation that disqualification currently requires candidates to have received a prison sentence imposed by a court of law. Phillips claimed that the row over the video had legitimised her perpetrator, created an even bigger audience for him, and as a consequence she had woken up to a torrent of people discussing whether they would or wouldn't rape her on her Twitter feed. This prompted former Conservative Home Secretary Amber Rudd to state that it's shocking that this needs saying, but it's not okay to joke, threaten or talk about raping a woman. Meanwhile, Sir Julian King, the European Commissioner for Internal Security, said that the abuse faced by Ms Phillips shamed Britain in the eyes of Europe and called for more national and EU-wide measures to tackle online hate speech. 2 days later, the West Midlands Police confirmed that they had launched a criminal investigation after Phillips accused Benjamin of malicious communications and a credible threat to rape. And in an exclusive interview with the BBC, she accused Benjamin of attempting to control her through his actions and described how she recently broke down in tears in Birmingham city centre because of the enormous weight of years and years and years of abuse.
It sort of dawned on me that for 4 years, essentially, this man has made a career out of harassing me, and I felt harassed. I felt like, how can somebody say that they would rape me if forced and be a legitimate candidate in an election? It was one thing when he was just some idiot off the internet with a load of bros following him. It's a different thing when he's standing on the same platforms that I'm standing on, that he will potentially go to a parliament himself as an elected representative when he said these things, and I just cannot believe our system is so weak at the moment that that's allowed to happen. This is essentially like coercive control. Sometimes I'd rather someone were to punch me in the face than the constant degradation that you suffer as a woman in the public eye. It is constant. It constantly belittles you. It makes you blame yourself. And initially...
You blame yourself?
I blame myself for some of this, yeah.
Why? For this? For what Carl Benjamin said in that video?
Yeah, I blame myself for accepting it for so long and for not doing more to try and stop it, actually. I blame myself for not having for the past 4 years to have changed directly the Electoral Commission rules that mean that they are actually completely, their hands are tied in this situation because people like me in Westminster didn't do enough to stop what is essentially the rise of fascism.
The purpose of this video is to reflect on the implications of excluding people from public platforms or from standing for public office in circumstances where they have been perceived in the court of public opinion to have issued threats of rape or violence or to have incited hatred. In doing so, it is my intention to highlight the potentially very political, authoritarian and undemocratic nature of the Fawcett Society's proposals, which include a proposed exemption for candidates who have committed acts of violence for politically motivated reasons, specifically citing Northern Ireland as an example. This video will examine some of the context and controversy surrounding the words and actions of the political candidate whose behaviour has been benchmarked as an appropriate bar for disqualification by Fawcett. And to do this most effectively, I want to examine this controversy within a framework or set of assumptions about open adult democratic public discourse, recently proposed by political editors Douglas Murray and Adrian Wooldridge in the aftermath of a Twitter storm concerning the words and alleged behaviour of the conservative philosopher Roger Scruton. I will also consider the perspective of a number of professional comedians and their thoughts on the extremely emotive subject of sexual violence. The purpose of this video is not to defend, or for that matter disavow, the words or actions of Carl Benjamin, or for that matter the words and actions of any public figures also considered, many of whom might also be affected by Fawcett's potentially draconian proposals, including Jess Phillips herself and the comedian Richard Herring.
What, you find rape funny? No. What? No. What? Ricky Gervais find rape funny? No. Listen, what? Ricky Gervais find rape funny? No. Listen, everyone. Listen.
In July 2012, the London Metro published an article by comedian Richard Herring where he shared an anecdote about once shutting up an overly talkative woman in his audience by telling her that she was the one woman in the world where a man would put Rohypnol in her drink and then leave her in the pub. The Metro removed the entire article following a series of complaints by public figures including feminists Laurie Penny and Owen Jones and journalist Alex Hem from The New Statesman. However, Herring remained unapologetic, arguing that he had been telling largely liberal and left-leaning audiences the same joke for years and that it was consistently one of his biggest guaranteed laughs. He also insisted that his joke was not about rape, stating that it's a joke, like many jokes that if you take it literally, you can argue is nasty, but that the nastiness is deliberately over the top and in response to provocation. It's a joke aimed squarely at a single inconsiderate person who is ruining the enjoyment of an audience full of people and at no one else. Herring's joke is strikingly similar to the one Carl Benjamin posted on social media 3 years later, in the sense that, while it is logical and reasonable to describe both as rape jokes, it is also reasonable and logical to assert the distinction that, technically speaking, neither joke is about rape. A distinction which may become relevant when considering Benjamin's more recent comments, which have triggered a police investigation and presumably may lead to an attempt to prosecute him under the Malicious Communications Act, given that a female member of Parliament has called on the police to act over something she has described on national television as a credible threat to rape. Clearly this is a matter for the police, possibly the CPS, and perhaps even a jury of Benjamin's peers. But Benjamin is adamant his words were clearly intended in humour, and that Phillips was not even the intended target of his joke. Phillips and many others have clearly been offended by his comments, and now cause us to consider the question: is it ever acceptable to joke about rape?
So now I'm arguing with quite a nice, sane person, presumably, who thinks this sort of thing's mental, but I'm fighting for his right to fantasize about me being raped by the devil. Because I'm so conscious of freedom of speech. What a topsy-turvy world, right?
My starting point when it comes to the consideration of any issue relating to free speech is my passionate belief that the second most precious thing in life is the right to express yourself freely. The most precious thing in life, I think, is food in your mouth. And the third most precious is a roof over your head. But a fixture for me in the number 2 slot is free expression, just below the need to sustain life itself.
Carl Benjamin's stated reasons for entering the political arena focus primarily on censorship and freedom of speech, so it is hardly surprising that his position on the subject of acceptable humour is that any subject can be the subject of a joke. The alternative is a world devoid of humour, the essential tool we use to reduce the horror of events that are beyond our control. Benjamin's politics have frequently been described as far right, and yet on this matter many people perceived as promoting progressive perspectives appear to entirely agree. People like self-confessed internet troll Richard Herring, who has fundraised for female victims of rape and sexual violence, and yet shares UKIP's position that people in the United Kingdom still have the right to joke about rape, stating that some people think you shouldn't joke about certain subjects, even obliquely, and they have the right to believe that. I disagree. I think humour is a good way to tackle serious subjects. This is also my right. I think the big subjects like death, love, hate, fascism, disability and prejudice must be tackled by humour, and that in many ways the best way to change people's prejudices is to make them laugh or point out how ludicrous their standpoint is. Other people think you must never joke about these subjects, so there's always going to be an impasse. Some people think it's better to hit out against these things by being serious or po-faced, or by insisting there are no subtleties or interpretation or opinion, and that you have to agree with them on everything or be castigated. And that's fine. I'm not sure it endears them to anyone other than the people who absolutely agree with them 100%. I also see that to laugh in the face of fear and bigotry and violence and death is a helping coping mechanism for some people. Not for all, but it would be a shame if the people who want to be able to laugh at the bad stuff that's happened to them aren't allowed to because of the ones who say you can never do that in any circumstance. There will always be some people who insist that you have to agree with them on everything or be castigated, but in Western democracies at least, such people tend to be pushed to the margins, especially if they espouse such views in public life. But before you definitely decide to agree or disagree with Richard Herring, let's consider the perspective of comedian Catherine Bohart, who recently disclosed her personal experience as a victim of sexual assault during a discussion with fellow left-leaning comedians Nish Kumar and Joylyn Rubinstein, specifically about Carl Benjamin's 2016 tweet and his subsequent entry into public life.
From Life of Brian to Brass Eye, from Jerry Sadowitz to, Frankie Boyle, there are constantly lines being drawn, walked over and rubbed out for good or for bad. So what is too far? Is there anything that should be totally off limits for you guys? Like, for instance, Catherine, can a rape joke ever be funny?
Nope.
No, never.
Nope.
So there is a line.
I think you can talk about the topic of rape perhaps having experienced it, and I think it's unlikely that when you do so, you are going to make jokes about it. Interestingly, the only people I've seen do rape jokes are young male comedians, and that's not me making like a sweeping judgment. That is literally my experience. The only ones rushing to tell me that it can all be up for grabs are young male comedians who, based on their content, I would suggest, have very little experience and have not been previously victims. The reason I don't think it gets funny in the first place is probably because I'm a woman who's experienced sexual assault. What? A woman who's experienced sexual assault? So I don't think it's a laugh out loud a minute, but more to the point, I think it requires a level of arrogance to suggest that you can, because the thing is, worse still than any of the rape jokes I've seen is that the fact that they've all been poorly constructed jokes, right? So I'm like, even if you tell me, yeah, but what if it's funny, right? It would have to be so funny. And I'm not arrogant enough to assume that I can write a joke that's funnier and more important than the impact of me bringing up rape in a room where there is most likely a victim who is going to be re-traumatized. 100%. And that is it. It's absurd to say, in any given room, there might not be. In any given room, there probably is. Okay, there's somebody who is or who has been or who knows somebody. It's two things. One, it's making them listen to that word and think about the word when they paid for a fucking babysitter and they're out having to have a night and they don't want to relive that trauma. But secondly, it's worse still. It's like that clapping in that clip earlier. Yeah, totally. It's listening to a room full of people laugh at the notion of what is the most life-altering, horrific crime that can happen to you. I don't think I can stress enough how much I think it's not. I think you're
totally right. So
I think you can do it, but I think you're a dick.
Well, then who decides? But who decides what's funny?
Oh, let's be clear. If you think rape's funny and you're going to make a joke, sure, but I'm going to think that you are an inconsiderate, self-absorbed idiot who has no measure of a room.
So, Some people clearly believe that there are some subjects that are completely off limits, and they may also have extremely personal reasons for defending that belief. We've just listened to 3 professional comedians essentially agreeing that under no circumstances would they joke or laugh about the subject of rape, and yet even they hold back from seeking to enforce their beliefs onto others, and instead ultimately point towards the responsibilities and potential consequences that come with free expression, and their own right to react to others in any way they see fit, which presumably in this case includes their right to choose not to subscribe to Benjamin's YouTube channel, pay money to see him at a live event, or indeed vote for UKIP, which, judging by their losses at the recent local authority elections, appears to be something of a growing trend, which in part is presumably caused by a relatively popular perception that UKIP are the party who like to joke about rape, and that, as Catherine Bohart describes it, their campaign launch appeared to involve a room full of people laughing at the notion of the most life-altering horrific crime. Of course, Catherine's perspective is entirely understandable, but as we progress to the concept of rape jokes plus context, I propose that it's also a flawed assessment of that particular room.
She did that thing that people do. She said, she didn't say, what, you find jokes about rape funny? She said, what, you find rape funny? And the answer to that is no, of course not. No one finds rape funny. Not even rapists find rape funny. Do you know what I mean? There's never been anyone giving evidence going, well, it was dark and he was wearing a ski mask and he was giggling. That's never...
Well, this is why I find. I mean, just going back to the clip, it's the clapping.
Yeah.
It's
I think
the
that's the kind of sinister. And like you say, being sat in a room, if that's something that you've experienced, being sat in a room where someone says it is bad, but being sat in a room where people approvingly laugh is worse.
I would like to ask Carl Benjamin why you think it is acceptable to say on Twitter that you wouldn't even rate a female Labour MP.
Because I don't think women are any different to men in the way that we should treat them. Unlike the establishment, unlike our judges who literally say, if you were a man, I would have sent you to jail, I think we should treat women the same as men. And that means if a woman is being a giant and laughing at male suicide, I'm going to be a giant back to her. Any questions?
So it's acceptable?
Yes!
It is acceptable to joke about raping a woman?
100% deal with it.
Comedian Nish Kumar's assessment of the previous clip is that the audience of predominantly young white men were approvingly laughing about rape. However, I think it's reasonable to propose that some, or possibly even most people, might struggle to entirely agree with that perspective, even in the absence of other context. And whether you personally agree or disagree with that proposition, I'd encourage you to seek out the full unedited footage of the press conference so that you can make a more informed measure of this particular room. Because one thing that it does very clearly show is that the audience become increasingly exasperated with the fact that the assembled media show no interest in probing the positions and political policies that this particular political party will be campaigning on, and instead repeatedly call for them to denounce one of their candidates' now 4-year-old Twitter pledge that under no circumstances would he rape a named Labour MP. A pledge, by the way, that the exact same media have disingenuously reported as the first of over 600 credible threats to rape sent to that MP in one 24-hour period. A claim that they have now repeated 3 years in a row. Indeed, there is by now quite an extraordinary amount of context to consider with this particular story, much too much to re-examine here and now. But for the uninitiated, the Glass Blind Spot has been following this story for over 4 years now, within the wider context of documenting the intersection between virtual abuse and online censorship, and in particular the exclusive and extremely political Reclaim the Internet campaign, co-founded by Jess Phillips and currently led by none other than the Fawcett Society, who style themselves as the UK's leading charity campaigning for gender equality. I'll post a short companion piece to this video, signposting to context documented in previous episodes of The Glass Blind Spot. Context that, in my humble subjective opinion, has now become extremely relevant to anyone seeking to make a reasonable assessment of the Fawcett Society's allegation that Carl Benjamin has incited hatred by promoting sexual violence. But for now, if we begin with a presumption of innocence to this charge, clearly the most relevant recent matter that requires examination is the context around Benjamin's recent second joke about rape. A joke that a member of parliament from a rival political party has interpreted as a credible threat to rape, and consequently called on the Electoral Commission to disqualify him and for the police to charge him with an offence.
So I was looking into the Brexit Party, and it turns out that it's being run by a man called Idi Farage, and he's running it along the lines of one man, one vote, and he's the man. Interestingly, one of my opponents is actually going to be Anne Widdecombe, Britain's most famous incel. UKIP's first party policy is going to be the outlawing of incels. So Anne Widdecombe has a problem.
You filmed a video while you were in Gibraltar. It was kind of like a stand-up comedy style video. So today on BuzzFeed, Mark DiStefano has been talking about that video in question, and obviously Kate McCann from Sky News has picked up on it. And what would your response be to that? Because they're basically implying that you're not fit to be a candidate.
Well, I don't care who they think is fit to be a candidate, and I'm not going to stop telling jokes. I think that when we allow the joke police to stop us from telling jokes and using our sense of humour, even if it's rude or offensive, which everyone can point to a comedian that they've enjoyed, like Jimmy Carr, David Baddiel, Ricky Gervais, Frankie Boyle, all of these people, and they've all given principled defence of the use of offensive comedy. I mean, that video was tagged as comedy. It was obviously a comedy skit. I even put in the description, it's a joke, BuzzFeed, don't take it so hard. And the pinned comment is, the bait is, the trap is set. They know what they're doing. They know that they're liars, and we can demonstrate this.
Again, I think there might be a double standard if you've got David Lammy calling basically the whole Conservative Party Nazis. So.
Well, yeah. I mean, they don't care, but why should I? I don't care what Kate McCann thinks is an appropriate candidate. I don't care what BuzzFeed thinks are appropriate jokes. I don't modulate myself by their standards. I don't see why anyone else would.
Benjamin clearly remains unapologetic, and when presented in its proper context, his words are clearly delivered in the form of a joke, referencing the media's arguably surreal or Pythonesque demand that he denounce his very public pledge not to rape a particular very public figure who very publicly claimed to have received thousands of written threats to rape immediately after spearheading a campaign to censor social media. And as clearly stated in the accompanying text to Benjamin's video, it is in fact a direct response to one of the media outlets who have accused him of committing a series of hate, thought or sex crimes since the start of his political campaign.
It's been a non-stop media smear campaign, which was entirely expected, and I apologise for nothing.
So you've been called, from what I remember, I think they've kind of insinuated that you... They've kind of put stuff about young boys and comments about young boys with you,
Yeah, what they've done is that they've taken me speaking about someone else's opinion and removed the context of that and made it sound like it was my opinion, which is pretty damn disgusting, and I'll be seeing if there's any kind of legal action I can take about this. Because they are unironically parroting someone else's opinion. I mean, they chop off the bit where I say, this is not my opinion, I don't stand behind this, and then present what was said as if it's my opinion. I don't know how much more dirty they can get.
But even with such additional context, many people will still view his actions as irresponsible or offensive. And as comedian David Baddiel pointed out, it is certainly possible to point to Phillips as being the intended target of what could certainly be interpreted as a misogynistic joke. Of course, one of the reasons Benjamin is campaigning for freedom of speech is that his UKIP running mate, Marcus Meehan, was recently convicted in a Scottish court for posting what could also reasonably be interpreted as an offensive joke. Comedians including Ricky Gervais and David Baddiel have defended his human right to do so, and perhaps crucially understood the structure and intended targets of his joke. And yet, perhaps for shock value, sections of the Scottish media report reported on the video in a relatively sensational manner, proposing that it could be perceived as anti-Semitic, a perspective that Crown Forces clearly concurred with when they arrested, charged, tried, convicted and fined him, despite no actual victim lodging an actual complaint. They also denied him the right to be tried by his peers, denied the right to appeal, and even reached into his personal bank account and took his money when he refused to pay his fine. All of which led comedian and writer Andrew Doyle to conclude that, given that prosecutors cannot be sincere in their belief that Meechan had intended to incite religious hatred, we are left with the only reasonable alternative, that the state's desire to protect people from offence now takes priority over their duty to uphold the fundamental democratic principle of freedom of expression. Meechan's Nazi pug video was classified as a hate crime, specifically the intention to incite religious hatred. And troubling for Carl Benjamin, the prosecution successfully managed to argue the precedent that context is entirely irrelevant when prosecuting comedy under the Communications Act 2003. Here's BBC Three regular Jonathan Pye discussing the implications of this landmark case.
What if you mock something and some twat is offended and some uptight, humorless judge doesn't get the joke? And because the Scottish legal system is so backward, you might not even get a fucking jury.
The Communications Act.
In that instance, this judge has basically said we are not allowed to make fun of Nazis in case it's misinterpreted. The prosecution said that context and intent are irrelevant, and the judge agreed. Think about that, Tim. In order to get a conviction, they had to willfully misunderstand the context of the video. The judge basically admitted it. He was convicted because the judge believed he was inciting racial hatred. It's a fucking pug dog. He was mocking Nazis. I'll tell you where else in history you'd be convicted of a crime for teaching your dog to mock Nazis. Nazi fucking Germany. You'd have had the fucking Gestapo kicking your fucking door in. And this matters. The law works in precedents. Once one person is convicted for telling a joke, that's it. And can we convict retrospectively? I mean, we have quite a lot of historical cases being tried at the moment. So, you know, why not convict John Cleese, Jerry Sadowitz? Let's dig Bill Hicks up. And if the judge has ruled that context is irrelevant, then surely even me reporting that he used the phrase gas the Jews is anti-Semitic. If context is irrelevant, I am right now inciting racial hatred according to the Scottish courts just by reporting the case. In which case, fuck it. If I'm going down in style. Hig style! Fight the doys have noiska! Never a fucking springtime for Hitler! And right, well, Tim, this is me miming being a Nazi fucking the Von Trapps.
Interestingly, Meechan was convicted under a slight update to the Post Office Amendment Act 1935, which takes into account more modern methods of electronic communications, with the notable exception of state-sanctioned programming on television or radio, which presumably is one reason why the chair of the Parliamentary Human Rights Committee wasn't arrested for telling a joke about the Holocaust on BBC One.
How do you get 100 Jews into a Mini, 1 in the driving seat, 99 in the ashtray?
But aside from the Orwellian possibility that while all animals are equal, some are more equal than others, if courts can willfully ignore context when condemning comedy and crucially criminalising the comedians of this world, then one can hardly expect the court of public opinion to be any more robust. And from this perspective, it's certainly possible to argue that in such a context, Carl Benjamin is guilty of a public election disqualification offence, simply because the Fawcett Society believe it to be so. And consequently, if they get their way and successfully lobby the state to enact the sort of public election disqualification order that would condemn Carl Benjamin to a lifetime ban from public office, without the necessity of a successful criminal trial, then the logical question would be, what happens next? And in the second part of this video, I will explain why, if Benjamin's name is the first to be added to some sort of stunning and Brave New World styled public election disqualification offence register, then it logically follows that Jess Phillips could be next.
Can't you see it too? There's an elephant in the room.